Hello, my name is Sharon, and if you're listening to this story, it's because in some way my path and yours have crossed. Today, I am the chef behind Maison Sharon, a restaurant that has become a reference point in the city. But believe me, the journey here has been a dish full of challenges, and, like any good recipe, some bitter ingredients have turned into the seasoning of my strength. I remember that dinner perfectly. Every detail is etched in my memory, not as an open wound, but as a scar that reminds me of where I came from and how much I've changed. The table, which I had meticulously set with polished silverware and flowers, picked from the yard, was full of loud voices, boisterous laughter, and above all, a cynicism disguised as concern that suffocated me. I had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, my small and modest apartment kitchen, the smell of garlic slowly browning in olive oil, the citrusy and tropical aroma of passion fruit being transformed into a sweet and sour sauce for the fresh shrimp I bought at the market at dawn, the rustic potatoes, roasted with rosemary gathered from the neighbor's garden, perfumed every corner of the house. It was a feast made with care, with an almost obsessive dedication. But even so, amidst that apparent celebration of family and food, no one took me seriously. No one, not for a second, looked at me with anything beyond condescension. I tried to start a conversation about the technique I used, about the origin of the ingredients, but my words were lost in the murmur, ignored, as if I were just a decorative figure in that setting I myself had created. It was my Aunt Norma who struck the first blow, and her voice, somewhat nasal and full of sarcasm, still echoes in my ears. She raised her wine glass, but her eyes were fixed on me, a poorly disguised glint of mockery in them. "You open a restaurant," she blurted out, with that short, dry laugh, a sound that gave me chills, and that strangely seemed to vibrate in my chest bone, reverberating in my chest like a tinny bell. "You can barely fry an egg without following a YouTube tutorial." And the laughter, oh, the laughter! It echoed through the dining room, ricocheting off the walls, each one a direct hit to my pride. I felt my face burn, a flush I tried to hide, lowering my head and forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. It was the kind of smile you give so you don't explode, so you don't show how much words, even when said in jest, deeply wound us, tearing us apart inside. I wanted to shout. I wanted them to know the dedication I had put into each dish, but my voice failed me, stuck in a knot in my throat. My brother Gustavo, always the most theatrical and expansive, slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses clink and the china vibrate. He laughed, a loud and uninhibited laugh, almost hysterical, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the universe. His eyes gleamed with amusement as he looked at me, almost with pity, with an unbearable air of superiority. "Seriously, Sharon, you're going to drop out of business school to become a chef?" He dragged out the word chef, crushing it, making it a synonym for failure, for a youthful whim that would soon pass, an absurd and hopeless idea. That word, which for me represented a dream, a passion, turned into an insult in his mouth, a weight that tried to sink me. He gestured, as if I were a lost cause, a hopeless endeavor, a waste of potential. I saw the disdain in his eyes, the absolute certainty that I was destined to give up, to fail miserably, and he seemed to revel in that certainty. My mother, Marlene, was different. She didn't laugh. No, her silence was much heavier than any mockery. While the others amused themselves at my expense, she simply sighed, an almost imperceptible sound, but one that carried the weight of all her frustrated expectations, all her unspoken worries. Her sigh spoke louder than any laughter, because it was the silence of disapproval, of resignation, of someone who had already given up on me before I even started. It was what told me, I warned you, this isn't for you. Follow the safe path, the path I planned for you. At that moment, every forkful of food became a knot in my throat, impossible to swallow. I swallowed the succulent chicken I had roasted, myself, the soft potatoes, the colorful salad, and along with the food, I swallowed the wounded pride that burned within me, the silent rage that bubbled beneath the surface, and the deep sadness that washed over me, enveloping me like a cold cloak. I looked at them, one by one, and kept the smile on my face, not because I was happy, far from it, but because I knew, with a certainty that sent shivers down my spine and made my heart beat faster, one day I was going to shut every one of those mouths. And that day arrived. The months following that dinner were a blur of bold decisions and sleepless nights. Their laughter echoed in my mind, not as a demotivator that made me shrink, but as fuel, a torch that ignited with every step. I was studying business administration, as my father had suggested, and my mother insistently supported, a path they considered safe and promising, with a guaranteed future. But every accounting class, every marketing theory, every productivity graph seemed to suffocate me a little more, stealing the air from my lungs. I found myself sitting in the uncomfortable chairs of the university, my mind far away, dreaming of sizzling industrial stoves, the clinking of sharp knives on cutting boards, and the intoxicating smell of meat broth simmering slowly in giant pots, filling the air with promises. My notebook no longer held financial formulas or flowcharts. It was filled with recipes I invented, drafts of menus with dishes that only existed in my imagination, unusual combinations of ingredients that made my mouth water. The existential crisis crept in, slow and painful. I felt like I was wasting my time, my life, living a lie to please others. The turning point, the click that changed everything, came in a particularly tedious statistics class. The professor was talking about probabilities, complex numbers, and standard deviations. Suddenly, a light went on in my mind, bright and undeniable. What was the probability of me being happy in a job I hated, following a path that wasn't mine? 0. What was the probability of me failing by trying what I loved, risking everything for a dream? Maybe 50%, maybe more, but at least it was a chance, a fair fight. But what was the probability of me regretting it forever if I didn't try? If I lived a life of what if, 100%, that number, 100%, hammered in my head. That day, I got up from my chair in the middle of the class, in the middle of an explanation about Gaussian curves, and simply left. I didn't go back. The decision was impulsive, yes, with a rush of adrenaline that made me tremble. But it was the truest, the most visceral, the most me decision I had ever made in my entire life. My mother's calls didn't take long to arrive, incessant and full of concern, disguised as control, followed by my father's endless sermons about responsibility and the future, and of course, my brother's sarcastic messages. See, she gave up. Typical Chirin, just another phase, right? But to my surprise, their voices no longer had the same power, the same ability to shake me. I was already on another wavelength, on another plane, with my focus on the smell of caramelizing onions, and not on their judgment. My journey in the kitchen began at the very bottom of the hierarchy, in a small and noisy Italian restaurant, in the city center. I was a dishwasher. My hands were calloused. My back ached at the end of each 12-hour shift. The smell of grease and tomato sauce ingrained in my clothes and hair. It was an exhausting job, almost inhumane, but I absorbed everything. I watched the cooks with an insatiable curiosity, asked incessantly about every process, snooped around the seasonings, the pots, the cuts of meat, every movement of the chef's knife, every cooking time of a fresh pasta, every seasoning added to a slow-cooked sauce was a lesson, a revelation. I would arrive home exhausted, my feet throbbing, but I would go straight to my tiny kitchen, a 4-burner stove, and a minuscule countertop that looked like a laboratory. I experimented, burned things, failed miserably, threw away entire dishes, and tried again, tirelessly, until I got it right. My nights were spent studying cookbooks I borrowed or stole from the library, watching documentaries about famous chefs who inspired me, unraveling the secrets of each technique, from the perfect mise en place to the emulsification of a delicate sauce. I learned about mother sauces, the backbone of classical cuisine, about the perfect doneness of meat, which completely changed the experience, about the importance of acidity to balance a dish in umami for depth of flavor. Every dish I attempted was an experiment, every failure a valuable lesson that propelled me to improve. The taste of crushed tomatoes with garlic and basil, the unmistakable smell of bread, baking in the oven, the perfect crispness of roasted chicken skin. These were my rewards, the small triumphs that kept me going. The path was long and arduous, punctuated by challenges that tested every fiber of my being. I got a job as a kitchen assistant in a more sophisticated restaurant where the pressure was immense and the chef sometimes yelled and threw pans. But I didn't care about the yelling, or the smoke, or the scorching heat. I was learning, absorbing every detail, every criticism, transforming them into a driving force. There were moments of despair, of course, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, with no money to pay the rent, eating only stale bread and water. The temptation to give up was real. My Aunt Norma's voice would return, whispering in my ear, an echo of that laugh. I warned you, you can't do it. Go back to college, Sharon. But I remembered Gustavo's mocking smile, my mother's sigh of disapproval, and the flame within me would reignite, stronger than ever. I couldn't give them the pleasure of seeing me fail, of confirming their predictions. The idea for Maison Chiron came to me on one of those sleepless nights, with my notebook and pen in hand, while the city slept outside. I wanted to create a place that was a reflection of my soul and my passion, welcoming, sophisticated, elegant in its simplicity, but with a cuisine that not only nourished, but also told stories, evoked memories. I started saving every penny I earned, doing extra jobs, selling gourmet lunchboxes that I prepared at home, experimenting with new recipes for the few customers who trusted my embryonic talent. It was a painstaking job, slow and exhausting, but every coin saved was a brick in the construction of my dream. When I finally managed to get a small loan, at exorbitant interest rates, I started looking for a place. I found an old building, almost in ruins, with peeling walls and precarious wiring, but with a classic architecture that enchanted me and a history that seemed to connect with mine. There was a melancholy charm there, a hidden potential. The first months were spent renovating, and I myself got my hands dirty, literally, painting walls, sanding old furniture to give it new life, carrying bags of cement, learning about plumbing and electricity from YouTube videos. Every detail, from the choice of tiles that would cover the kitchen to the type of lighting that would create the perfect atmosphere in the dining room, was thought out and executed with care, with an obsessive attention. I wanted every customer to feel at home. Yes, but in a home that offered an unforgettable gastronomic experience. one that transcended the simple act of eating. The opening was modest. Just a few friends and acquaintances who believed in my potential. I was terrified, my hands sweating and my heart pounding. The first month was incredibly difficult. Few customers, many empty tables, and a flood of doubts that haunted my nights. The voice of self-sabotage whispered in my ear, repeating my family's jokes. But I didn't give up. I kept adjusting the menu, refining my techniques, listening to every feedback from the few customers, even the harshest criticisms. I learned to handle pressure, to improvise, to be resilient, and little by little, word of mouth began to spread. A positive review on a local food blog, then a mention in a smaller newspaper. Suddenly, reservations started to increase, first timidly, then exponentially. Maison Charon was coming to life, breathing, conquering its place in the gastronomics scene. I saw the sparkle in the eyes of the customers, the satisfaction on their faces after each bite, and I knew, with a deep certainty, that every sacrifice, every drop of sweat had been worth it. 5 years after that dinner that marked the beginning of my personal revolution, there I stood, on the other side of the imposing glass door of Maison Charon, the most sought-after restaurant in the city. The specialized magazines said the morning sunlight kissed the golden lettering, engraved with my name, a silent and brilliant reminder of my victory, visible to anyone who wanted to see. The aroma wafting from my kitchen was a perennial symphony, fresh coffee mixed with the sweet smell of freshly baked bread, the subtle smokiness of meat being slowly prepared at low temperature, and the herbaceous notes of basil and rosemary dancing in the air, creating a welcoming and sophisticated atmosphere. The vibration of the place was palpable, a perfect blend of impeccable professionalism and a creative energy that propelled every member of my team, from the kitchen assistants to the waiters. Reservations sold out for 3 months, with waiting lists for cancellations. My phone wouldn't stop ringing, and the online system was always congested, with customers eagerly seeking a spot. National and international awards adorned the walls of the office, each one a tangible validation of my hard work. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, rave reviews from renowned publications across the country, partnerships with international brands of fine wines and artisanal olive oils from millinery olive trees. All of it was proof. I didn't need to shout for the world to hear me, to prove my worth. I didn't need to beg for recognition, for a place in the sun. It was enough to cook. Every dish that came out of my kitchen was a declaration of love for gastronomy, an edible work of art. Every flavor, an irrefutable argument for my passion, dedication, and talent. The kitchen was my sanctuary, my most sacred stage, and my dishes, my most eloquent voice, more powerful than 1,000 words. I moved through the dining room with a confidence I didn't even know I was capable of possessing, a silent authority that came from deep knowledge. I knew every detail, every texture, every nuance of flavor that would come out of my kitchen, anticipating every need, every problem. It was a knowledge that went beyond technique. It was an intuition cultivated by years of passion and persistence, an extension of my own soul. With every sincere compliment, with every customer who left with a satisfied smile and a promise to return, I felt a piece of the knot that had formed in my chest at that dinner 5 years ago, untying itself, dissolving into the air. It was as if every compliment was a balm for the wounded soul, a living proof that the girl who swallowed her pride and tears had transformed into an unshakable woman, strong and in control of her own destiny. I was finishing reviewing the lunch menu my notes scattered on the cold marble countertop, pen in hand. Making the final fine adjustments, the menu was a symphony of seasonal flavors, with a touch of boldness in each dish, carefully designed to awaken the senses and surprise the palate of the most demanding customers. The silence in the kitchen, before the frenzy of lunch, was punctuated only by the soft whoosh of the extractor fan, the occasional clinking of a pan being put away, and the almost imperceptible crackle of something being prepared for the staff's lunch. It was then that Anna, the receptionist, a young woman with expressive eyes and always impeccable in her uniform, approached. Looking slightly awkward, with an expression I already knew. It was the expression of someone bringing unexpected news. Perhaps even a little embarrassing for her. "Sharon, there's a family outside. They say they're your relatives." I felt a shiver down my spine. A strange and complex mix of surprise, curiosity, and an undisguisable pang of satisfaction that I didn't bother to hide. It was the scene I had imagined so many times. In the most difficult moments of my journey, in the days of despair and loneliness, this was the moment of the final proof, the ultimate validation, the moment to turn the page once and for all. Behind the linen curtain, I glimpsed 3 silhouettes that I would recognize, even with my eyes closed. Even though time had passed and distance had separated us, my mother's slightly more stooped body, which time had wrinkled, my brother's somewhat disheveled posture, who seemed to have aged faster, and my aunt's slightly more rigid and tense silhouette, who was trying to maintain her composure. Marlene, Gustavo, Aunt Norma. Time seemed to stop in the dining room of Maison Charon. For a moment, the murmur of the kitchen disappeared. The smell of food dissipated. And all that existed was that moment, the inevitable reunion. Almost like a scene from a movie. They were poorly dressed, their clothes faded and rumpled, contrasting drastically with the discreet and sophisticated elegance of my restaurant, with tense, nervous expressions. Their shoulders were hunched, a sign of defeat, and their eyes, once full of scorn and superiority, now looked small, frightened, and hesitant. And for the first time in their lives, they weren't laughing. There was no mockery, not the slightest hint of that old derision that had hurt me so much. Only an uncomfortable stillness hung over them, a silence that screamed the weight of the situation, the tacit recognition of my success and their failure. I felt a chill, but not from the cold. It was the sensation of a cycle closing, a prophecy being fulfilled, a destiny being revealed. Victory was even sweeter when served cold, without the heat of the impulse or the rage that had once consumed me. I already knew the answer before even asking. Their presumption was evident, but I maintained the formality I had learnt as a chef. "Do they have a reservation?" I asked, my voice calm, almost monotonous, without betraying the turmoil of emotions that, although contained, churned within me. Anna shook her head, an almost imperceptible gesture of denial. Of course they didn't. They would never bother to follow the rules of my world, a world they had discredited, diminished, and mocked for so long. The presumption that, because they were family, the rules didn't apply to them, was palpable, almost offensive. I walked to the door, each step deliberate, slow, as if I were walking down an invisible red carpet leading to my triumph. I opened it calmly, without haste, as if I were unwrapping a carefully packaged gift, but with a serenity that contrasted with the anxiety I felt at facing them again. The cold air from the street contrasted sharply with the warm and fragrant atmosphere of my kitchen, bringing with it the smell of pollution and wet asphalt. A reminder of the world outside, the cruel world I had conquered with so much effort, where the rules were clear and merit was everything. They looked at me as if they had seen a ghost, or perhaps a mirror reflecting their own choices and the path they hadn't taken. My Aunt Norma's wide eyes, Gustavo's evasive gaze, who seemed unable to look at me, his eyes fixed on the floor, and my mother's visibly tired face, with deep dark circles under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. "Sharon! Daughter!" my mother began, her voice low, almost a drawn-out whisper, a thread of voice that barely reached my ears. There was a hesitation there, a vulnerability I had never heard in her voice before, a tone of pleading. She, who had always been so sure in her criticisms and unsolicited advice, who had never doubted her own words, now looked shrunken, uncertain, almost unrecognizable. The glimmer of pride that a mother should have in her eyes was not there, replaced by a silent plea, a quiet lament. "Sharon, what a beautiful restaurant. Look at it. It doesn't even look like something you'd do," said Aunt Norma, her voice trying to sound enthusiastic, but with a visible effort to force a smile. It was a fake smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, which seemed full of envy, shock, and a stored resentment. The sentence was a compliment mixed with the old mockery, a pathetic attempt to diminish my merit, as if she still couldn't believe that something so good, so grand, could have come from me, from that clumsy niece who could barely fry an egg. She still couldn't accept what her eyes were seeing, the undeniable reality of my success. Gustavo lowered his head even further, his gaze fixed on the polished floor, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight, shame evident in every fiber of his being. Not a word. His silence, once full of mocking laughter and derision, was now one of pure shame and embarrassment. The one who had always been the most vocal in my disapproval was now the most silent, unable to utter a single syllable. "Did you come to eat?" I asked, my voice still calm, without emotion, almost like an echo in the grandeur of my dining room. The air became thick, heavy, and the tension was palpable. They nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, their heads lowered like scolded children. That gesture, so small, carried the weight of years of disdain and the seeking of a favor they never deserved. "Sorry, without a reservation, you can't come in," I said, with the same calmness they had used to laugh at me that night, 5 years ago, when they saw me as a joke. There was no anger in my voice, not a trace of resentment that consumed me. There was only a fact, an unbreakable rule of my business, of my life. I had learned to transform anger into discipline, sadness into iron determination. My voice was the voice of authority, not of emotion, and my words, the sentence. Marlene tried to insist again, her voice a little stronger now, with a tone of desperate pleading that touched me, but didn't move me. "But we're your family." The word family sounded empty, without the weight it should have had, devoid of any genuine warmth or affection. For me, at that moment, it was just an empty label, a weak argument, an excuse that didn't justify years of contempt. I took a deep breath, my lungs filling with the delicious aroma of my restaurant, the smell of success and resilience, my eyes fixed on hers, without looking away, an unyielding wall. "And at the dinner 5 years ago, you laughed at me as if I were a joke. You belittled me. You humiliated me in my own home, the home I struggled to maintain. Today, that joke has become reality, a brilliant and tangible reality that I built with my own hands, with every sacrifice you never saw, every drop of sweat, every tear shed in secret. And you only came when it was beautiful, when success was already plastered on magazine covers, when I no longer needed you, when the recognition was undeniable. You didn't come when I was starting out, when I needed support, a word of encouragement, a minimum of faith. You came to take advantage of something you didn't help build. I didn't raise my voice, didn't shout, didn't demand anything. I simply stated the truth, naked and raw, with a cutting coldness that was worth more than 1,000 screams. Not with the burning passion or the revolt they perhaps expected. It was the truth served unseasoned, bitter, and impossible to swallow. They stood there, frozen, like statues of salt, their faces locked in shock and disbelief, time stretching out painfully, as if they expected me to change my mind, that the Sharon of 5 years ago, the Sharon who swallowed her pride and tears, still existed, the Sharon who sought their approval, who longed for a place at the table. But I hadn't changed. The girl they mocked had died at that dinner, and in her place, the chef, the businesswoman, the woman who no longer bowed before anyone, who had learned to value herself above any external validation, had been born. I had risen from the ashes of that contempt, stronger and more determined than ever, with a new skin, a new soul. I closed the door gently, the soft sound of the latch echoing in the air, sealing not only the entrance to the restaurant, but also the end of an era in my life, the last page of a painful chapter. I took a deep breath, my lungs filling with the delicious smell of my kitchen, welcoming me back, embracing me with the certainty of my purpose, of my place in the world. I returned to the kitchen, the familiar bustle of clanking dishes and simmering pots bringing me back to the reality of my world, the world I had created myself, with my own rules and values. That night, I served 50 tables, each one a celebration of my success, my effort, my resilience. I received effusive praise from critics who came from afar to experience my creations. And the next day, my photo graced the cover of a renowned gastronomy magazine with the title, Sharon, the flavor of overcoming. They taught me to cook, with fire in my soul, with anger and determination, propelling me at every step, every seasoning, every new technique. But it was I who chose never again to serve crumbs to those who only knew how to feed me with contempt. And with every dish I created, every flavor I perfected, I celebrated not only my professional success, but also my non-negotiable freedom, the freedom to be who I wanted to be, without anyone's approval, without the need to validate my existence or my dreams through the eyes of others. I had seasoned my life with resilience, passion, and a pinch of stubbornness, and the result was a masterpiece that I was proud to serve to the world. And to my family, I had served my truth, cold and without any side dishes.